Susan, I am so happy to be interviewing you about your book and also just the topic of connection. I feel like this is something we have talked about for a long time. We connected many years ago, so it's near and dear. And also the symbolism of this evening. This is a moment of emergence. We're all, hopefully, as we emerge from this pandemic, coming out and wondering, where do we go from here? And I think as someone who's covered technology for a long time, and we've been like starving through the lens of technology for humanity, I think that's going to play a huge role in this as well. And there's just so many questions. So all that to say, I'm excited that we are sitting here with the expert on it. So I mean, let's go back to June. I was speaking with you over Zoom, and you were doing research for your book that is now out, The Lost Art of Connecting. You decided to write a book on connection and the lost art of connecting. And it was timed wonderfully because we were in a pandemic. First of all, why did you decide to write the book?
Well, first of all, thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Reboot. It's an honor to be here with you, and I have been a forever fan. And I have to say, being on this side of talking to you is a little scary, but I'll put that aside. Interestingly enough, the actual thesis for the book was put forth 4 years ago. And it was my reaction to the fact that I felt we had become slaves to the clicks and the likes and the followers as a means to measure our connections and our ability to build relationships, myself included. And a friend of mine said to me that when she dropped her 10-year-old and 12-year-old off at the school bus and would hug them goodbye and bid them adieu and send them up on the bus, she would see them sit in their respective seats. And as soon as they sat down, their heads bopped down to look at their handheld devices, as well as every other child on the bus. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't have great memories of my school bus days. However, I did speak with my schoolmates, and I would talk to them about what they did the evening before or what was coming that day in class. So that sent me a kind of a signal that we were on the wrong path. And so I put forth my book proposal. And of course, when I started to write, it was February of 2020, and things, we were going along. And then, of course, March 2020, the world shut down, and all we had was the technology. But I will say that over the 8 months of writing the book and interviewing people like yourself, I felt that we were being more intentional with our technology. And that hopefully now, when we're on this precipice of reemerging, that we will be more intentional, and that when we do reemerge, we're not talking to people and actually looking at our computers, or our devices, thinking that's more important than the actual conversation at hand. And I will just say that I liken this period we're in right now almost to purgatory, because it's kind of like we have one big toe out the door, but the rest of us are in. And for those of us who live in cities, we're in apartment buildings, I almost liken it to, when your neighbors order really aromatic food, maybe it's Indian or Thai or Chinese, and you smell the aromas, but guess what? You don't get any. That's what we're in right now.
Right. Well, I mean, and I think it'll be interesting when we emerge, like when we reemerge from this moment. How will we connect? What will it mean to have a meaningful connection? And you talk about how everything needs, to be a little bit more calculated and how we do it, right? When will we have a Zoom meeting? When will we actually meet in the real world? And how will we decide? It almost feels like, and I remember thinking this as someone who's covered technology for a long time, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was just thinking to myself, all the rules are out. Like everything is going to change. And when we come out of this, it's just going to be a different playbook, right? So how, as someone who studies these connections, who actually knows how to build meaningful relationships, like what advice do you give to people as we come out of this? And there's kind of this like awkward in between of people not even knowing, do we get on the phone? Do we meet in real life? Are we going to Zoom? Like, what is the world even going to look like when it comes to connection?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball,
Right.
but I believe we all have a do-over opportunity right now. And when in life have we had that? You know, maybe back when the Ten Commandments were pronounced, maybe this is very similar in some
Yeah.
mystical way, right? Where we can actually be very intentional about the community and communities we want to build around us to help us meet our goals, perhaps for the next 4 years, 4 months, or even 4 weeks. And I
Mm,
do think we're not going to go 0 to 60. You know, for people who are trepidatious right now that all of a sudden they're going to be in rooms of 50 to 100 people, that sounds scary after a year and a half, or
right.
excuse me, a year of being isolated. I think it's going to be gradual. I do think we are going to see, certainly from a professional standpoint, a very hybrid situation where we continue in many cases, certainly with, you know, global or geographical reach, being able to do meetings via Zoom or Microsoft Meet Teams. But I do also think we're gradually going to come together in groups of four and or six, because we know, you know, productivity is better when you have people together. Okay. But again, I really believe it's going to be hybrid. And I think for those of us now, this is a perfect time to start being intentional about reconnecting with people we haven't perhaps connected with in a while. And you have a perfect excuse. We've been in bloody hell for a year. Okay. Secondly, be intentional about building communities around you that are going to help you reach your goals, and be extremely intentional about building communities that don't just look like you, sound like you, same color as you, same age as you. So I think the onus is on us, and it's a great opportunity the next few months to be doing so.
So if we could just like pull it all back, and if you know, you're the expert on connecting, you've connected so many people, and I say that because, you know, I think people underestimate the power of connection, and we can, and networking can get a you know, can sound terrible. And I think about, even I was at CNN for much of my career, and you go to these networking events, and right, and sometimes you just want to like, I think there's actually a line in your book about how you want to like sometimes go hide in your room and eat room service. Like you are literally looking at someone who has like escaped to go eat French fries in bed. So I totally, I think it can actually like have that effect to some degree. But you totally, in this book, reframe how we need to look at building connections. Instead of, you know, talking about building a network, you talk about, you know, creating like a constellation, right? So I want to get into that, but I just want to talk about the idea of building a meaningful connection. Like, what is the secret? And maybe this is
Yeah.
oversimplified, but like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what is the secret to building a meaningful connection?
Sure. Well, what I have found, and again, this is from my perspective over my lifetime, is pivoting what we have always been taught about networking, and that is get, give me, fill me, grab business cards, you know,
Right.
meet as many people in the room, the numbers game, to distill it down to very, I almost go to the word intimate, and I don't mean that word of intimate, but this notion of one-on-one, deeper connections, and leading with this notion of how can I be of help rather than what can I get. It's a 180-degree pivot, but when you are holding a conversation with someone and you tend to make it more about them and leading with how you can be helpful to them, it completely changes the dynamic. And I am not suggesting, and I want to make sure everyone understands this, I am not suggesting that we are not helping ourselves first. This is not about taking, you know, giving the oxygen mask to someone else. I am suggesting that when we lead with how can we be helpful, we're actually helping ourselves.
Right.
So
Yeah. I mean, um, your methodology you speak about, you actually have like a methodology in the book, right? It's very clear. It's gather, ask, do. And I think that's very much a part of this. Can you get into some of the specifics around around the methodology that you talk about
sure.
when it comes to it?
Sure. Well, the funny thing is for the last 30 years, and I'm giving away my age. I'm 56, so I've been working for about 30 years now. People have always said, Susan, you need to write a book to share with everyone how you've connected people and how you've built this constellation of connections. And I kept thinking, oh, the last thing the world needs is just hearing my voice. Hence why I made the book very much about showcasing other leaders like yourself who definitely make connecting and communicating with others a tool and a very much part of your career path. But when you put forth a book proposal, you have to put forth a methodology or you don't get the proposal. So I had to do a lot of self-reflection to determine really how have I done this? And it really did come down to the gather, ask, do. And I'll give you just kind of the highlights. And of course, the book dives into much greater detail. But during the gather section, you actually first and foremost determine for yourself what is a meaningful connection. Okay. That is such a personal question because what it might be for you might be very different than it is for me. Also, during that process, you think really intentionally about the community that you want to build around you that is going to help you meet your goals. And these goals can be over, the next several months or the next several years. Also, in that gather phase, you think about and determine what are the secret sauces or chief differentiating factors that you can offer up to the community. Hence, how can I help? And whether we're 22 and right out of college or approaching retirement, we all have gifts. We all have super skills that we can share. And I go so far as suggest if you don't know what your super skills are, your chief differentiating factors, ask the people around you, ask the people that love you, ask your dog, really, because we all have those. And lastly, think very intentionally of how you're going to diversify your community and make sure it doesn't look just like you. Once you do that, you can get to the ask phase. And when we think of ask, we typically think of asking for what we need, what we want, what we deserve, which I definitely recommend. But in this case, the ask phase is all about asking others the meaningful questions that will give you the data that helps you understand where they are, what their hopes and dreams are, what their challenges are. And if you listen carefully to what they're saying, and believe me, I learned a lot about how bad we are at listening, you can get to the phase that I love the most, and that is the do phase. And that is when you take all that data that you heard and listened to, and then follow through and become the helpful, responsible, reliable, and all important, trustworthy person that gets the proverbial SHIT done.
I mean, it is interesting, right? Like you think about it, I think about all the networking events, and I'm sure a lot of the folks listening to this, like have been to a lot of these events where you're meeting people and you're talking, pulling out some of these gems, right? I don't know the last time someone walked up to me, right? And it's like, what do you do? What do you, whatever. And so like, how can I help? Right.
Yeah.
And so it is like these little things that you do think you're like, oh, actually like that does like, instead of putting you on the automatically like, okay, what do I need to give this person? How to, and that takes energy. It talks about kind of giving energy in a different way. So it certainly is a different way of thinking about it. I was struck by that when I was reading it.
Well, and again, I can imagine that some people might think it's manipulative in some shape, way, or form, but you're not just walking up to a stranger and saying, "Hi, how can I help you?"
Right.
And actually, one of the chapters of the book, and this is ideal for people who are shy or introverted.
Yeah.
It gives you like 11 questions that you can have in your back pocket for those awkward moments when you're like, what do we talk about? And instead of talking about the weather or talking about, what you had for lunch today, it's asking more meaningful questions like, at the end of this damn pandemic, if you could pick one place on the planet to go to, where would you go? Or, if you could solve one huge problem in the next month, if money wasn't the answer, what would it be? These types of questions lead you to understand ways that maybe you can be helpful. And then in your follow-up, if you listened, what you can do is what I think is the greatest gift we can give to one another. And that is show that we saw them and heard them by sending a response saying, I enjoyed our discussion about, the fact that you really, really want to work to help with racial equality. And, I happen to be involved in a nonprofit that is working on this. Is there anything I can be doing? Man, I'm using that as an example.
it's interesting because one of the points in the book, which should be like a no-brainer but by the way, but I think kind of goes missing sometimes, is that one of the best ways to communicate effectively is by being a good listener. And I, by the way, I think about this like, and not to, I think about this from a reporting standpoint. One of the things I learned very early on as a reporter, because I remember when I started out at CNN, I just started going on camera. I remember having questions in front of me and wanting to ask people. This was over a decade ago. Now I'm going to age myself. But I started remembering, I started learning that the best answers you get are when you actually listen, right? Like, and it's never the question. Like, even if you're sitting in front of Mark Zuckerberg and asking him a question, it's when you listen to what he said and you follow up, right?
Yes,
it's listening
yes.
that gets you the answer you want. So that's from the work, from like the work
Right, right.
standpoint. And so I thought it was such a striking point where you talk about just the power of listening
Yeah.
as an effective means of communication, which I just think sometimes
Oh,
people forget. So I don't, how do we become better
better
listeners?
listeners.
What advice would you give
Sure,
to
sure.
people to become better listeners,
Yeah.
especially putting on my tech hat in an environment
Oh.
where everyone just seems to be shouting at each other on the internet?
Well, not only that, when we're in these proverbial Zoom rooms or Microsoft Teams rooms or whatever platform,
Yeah,
we also have our email running, we have text,
sure.
we have TweetDeck, we have
Yeah,
many of us have children at our feet. I mean, good
yeah,
Lord, could we not make it more difficult to be
yeah.
successful listeners? I mean, in the research for the book, I studied a variety of talks that Dr. Julian Treasure gave on the TED platform, which I would highly recommend.
Hmm.
And one of the things he is adamant about is not being reaction, not be like thinking about your next question, which I think you just
Hmm.
very eloquently described, but really paying attention. And
Yeah.
some of the, a few tips I have that has helped me, especially as I've gotten older, is I carry a little notepad around with me. And when I am listening to someone, I take notes because it
Mm.
forces me to pay attention. And
Right.
also, I've learned that it is completely appropriate when you zone off and start thinking about your dinner or what's for dinner. You can ask the person to repeat themselves. And sometimes that's actually a gift because it lets them realize that you are doing your best to pay attention. And
Yeah.
lastly, I always, because even if we do listen, we only retain so much.
Hmm.
You use those notes so that when I follow up with the person, I mention something that they said. It again
Right.
reiterates in my mind and it solidifies it. And again, it shows that person that you were listening and you saw them. And I do think that that is a gift. So I think whatever is going to help you focus is the most important. And I think if we look at this past year and the isolation so many of us have had, when we are back in rooms with people, put our phones down and
Yeah.
actually just pay attention.
There's the book touches on this. It was almost like the psychology of just being seen. Like people, I mean, this is just like a human thing, right? Like people just want to be seen. It goes a long way. I go back to thinking about reporting. I think when I'm reporting, if I really am interested in the person I'm reporting, right? If it's like a long interview and I'm doing something, I will go back. I remember interviewing Ev Williams, one of the founders of Twitter, and going back and looking at his old blog posts, right? Like from like over a decade ago, and looking at little like poems he wrote to
Yeah.
show that you're paying attention, right? And brought it up at a time when like you don't know each other and it's kind of awkward at first. You want to show people that you see them or that you're
Yes.
paying attention. And I think when people ask, well, how do you develop relationships with whether it's tech founders throughout the years or sources? And I think the same probably is kind of it was so interesting to watch you describe this methodology, like put it into a methodology, stuff that has actually worked, I think,
Thank you.
in some capacity, or I could do a better job of when you're looking at
Well,
like this. And I think maybe even when I was thinking, okay, maybe it's when I literally, when you wrote that paragraph about wanting to sometimes hide in your room, because I'm a closet introvert,
Yeah.
wanting to go hide in your room and have like room service, and how you can reframe this idea of networking into
Yep.
something different. Maybe dig into that a little bit, because I
Sure.
really related to that. I think a lot of people, we don't even realize some people are closet introverts, right? And so maybe give some advice to people, maybe like me,
Well,
who seem to
of course.
be, okay in these social situations, but do sometimes just want to go eat French fries in bed.
Well, I'll tell you a secret. There have been many
Yeah.
times yes, me, Miss Extrovert, has wanted to hide in the bathroom. And
Uh-huh.
because of that, I interviewed one of a nationally known expert on introverts,
Uh-huh.
Maura Aaron's Melee, who wrote a book called Hiding in the Bathroom.
Uh-huh.
And she had fabulous tips. And one of the chapters in the book is all about connecting for introverts. And I do think when we delineate the difference between networking and building meaningful relationships, that gives a bit of a relief, I think. And one of the suggestions I recommend is the power of threes, meaning whether you're in an online room or a real room, think of it this way: go with the idea of meeting three people, sharing three things, and learning three things, or walking away with three things.
Hmm.
That is doable. That is palatable. And then you can go hide in your hotel room and eat French fries. But at least that
Right.
way you have, you've moved the needle. And instead of walking away with 25 cards that you will then put on your counter, and like a week later, you're like, who are these people? You'll have
Yeah.
three relationships starting. The
Yeah.
other thing I want to address, which you were mentioning, and as a reporter, you have learned this art, and I'm sure done so beautifully, is doing your research before you reach out to people. So,
Yeah.
we all have been on the end of those emails or notes or LinkedIn requests from people saying, "Can I pick your brain?" And I am certainly not anti helping people wanting to pick my brain. I can understand why many people seek out help, and I would never scold people for that. But I think if we reframe that question and do the research on the person, first of all, and find
Yeah.
out a little bit about them before you reach out. And I have to tell you this: you have all the tools at your disposal. My
Right.
background,
Right.
I was a journalist in the 80s. I was
Hmm.
a researcher for USA Today before the internet existed. And the tools I had were the Yellow Pages and the Encyclopedia Britannica. Today, before you reach out to a senior executive at the company you work, or somebody you're looking to help you get funding for your company, or if it's a nonprofit you work for, you can Google them. You can look at them on LinkedIn. You can find out if they have grandchildren, for God's sakes, by looking at their Instagram. So that when you reach out, you can talk about them and maybe
Right.
figure out some way to say, how can I be helpful? And then make the ask. And
Yeah.
I'll give you just a quick example. The week of my book launch a few weeks ago, I received an email from a young woman, who will remain nameless, who said, "Dear Susan, I saw you speak at blah, blah, blah conference last summer. I am now working on my MBA. Can I set up time with you so I can pick your brain?" Okay.
Right.
Now, I am no, like famous person of any kind, but all I thought to myself was, she could look at my Twitter feed. She could look at my
Right.
Facebook. She could look at my LinkedIn. I launched a book, right?
Right.
And
Right.
had she just said, "Susan, congratulations on your book. Is there anything I can do to be helpful? And oh, by
Yeah.
the way, I'm working on the MBA." The entire situation would have been different.
Right. There's such a good line in the book. It's like when you view someone as a whole human and not merely a data point, a
Yes,
transaction, or a vehicle to close a sale, that genuine transaction can transpire. I think people
bingo.
underestimate that. I
Yeah.
think that's kind of what you're getting at. Going to kind of looking at us emerging from this strange, strange, and sad and life changing, I would say, year and a half. I always have to put, because my whole background is looking at technology and humanity. It's part of what we spoke about a little bit when we were chatting for the book. I do wonder, like these experiences, these Zoom experiences we have, they lack a certain, I mean, this has a lot of humanity, don't get me wrong, but they do lack a
Oh
certain
yeah,
amount of humanity that you can't replace the real thing. So I guess for the connections expert, right? Like how do we make, because I don't think we will ever go back to the way things were. I think we will have a hybrid approach, and there will be difficult questions as we emerge from this about how do we code humanity into the new normal.
right.
And so as someone who specializes in connections in humanity, how do we make a Zoom meeting more intimate, since this will
Sure.
become a part of the new normal?
Yeah.
And how do we replace, the serendipity, or maybe we can't replace it, but the serendipity of walking to a meeting together, and having those connections? Is there a way to create some kind of experience online for that? What suggestions would you give,
Sure. Well,
organizations or people?
well, first of all, I place a lot of onus on the leadership of the organization, whether it's a business or a nonprofit, et cetera, to set the intentionality of building connection and compassion into the workplace. Because
Yeah.
if it isn't set from the top, it's not going to be comfortable for all the rest
Hmm.
of the employees. And what I learned in research for the book is if employees are better connected on a more meaningful level, they're actually more productive, they're happier, their longevity is much better at the company. So shame on leadership if they're not trying to create atmospheres where that can happen. And
Hmm.
it is difficult when we're living in this kind of isolation. So how do you open up these Zoom meetings in a way that creates a safe space for people to be their true selves? And I realize that, I'm not suggesting we go ahead and, tell everybody our deep, dark secrets. But
Right.
I do think we can't expect people to feel comfortable being themselves if leadership is very close knit. And Lori, I think I shared this with you. I've been alone for 13 months. Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
solely alone.
Yeah.
Um, no parents, no children, no partner. And it's been maddening. And there were
Yeah.
times I would come to meetings. Now, granted, I run a small company. We're hiring our 13th and 14th employee this week. So,
Hmm.
by no means it's massive. But I would come to meetings with tears in my eyes. And part of
Yeah.
me thought, wait, I need to hide that. I need to be stoic. And I learned after a few months that actually by being human, that allowed my employees, many of which had never met each other, to actually be
Right.
themselves too. And it created so much connection between them. It was actually really remarkable to watch. So, I don't have the answers of what kind of the future is going to look like, but I think we really, really, those of us in power or holding power, needs to actually make this part of the workplace and create those water cooler moments, in whatever capacity is possible. And I also, I joke, but the Zoom chat has become a
Hmm.
really effective way to reach out to colleagues, to check on them, to maybe set up time not during meetings. And, when we were in meeting after meeting after meeting, you couldn't have side chats during the meeting, you'd get in
Right.
trouble. So this
Right.
isn't a very effective, obviously I wouldn't suggest you don't respect whoever is running the meeting and, have a full long conversation,
Hmm.
but you can use that to reach out to folks and say, are you doing okay? Is there anything I can be helpful? Or if you're a new employee at a company, it is a perfect opportunity to say, hi, I'd like to maybe, set up 10 minutes with you so I can learn more about your work so I can be
Yeah.
helpful. Rather than, I'm new at the company, can I pick your brain so I can get help?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was going to go into my next question. Is like, how do you, we talked about how do you build a meaningful connection, but how do you deepen a digital connection? Right. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
and that, I guess that goes to that point of like, how do you, especially when everything is digital now, what is your
Yeah.
advice for deepening digital connections? I think you had something in the book that was like following up with people and emailing
Yeah,
a
yeah.
week. You actually have like a prompt for this, or methodology around
Well,
it.
I mean, I'm a little neurotic about staying in touch with people. And I sometimes say, it's a little like Velcro. And I probably have pushed people away because I'm just very like all in. But it's just I can't redo myself at this point in life. But every day I reach out to 3 to 5 people. And that has become even more intentional this past year for two reasons. One, I just want to put a little joy out in the world. And
Yeah.
sometimes I will just, and probably people listening to this have been recipients of that, where I just say, thinking of you or sending love or are you doing okay? And there are two reasons.
Mhm.
Again, one, I want to send joy. And two, it's kind of my way of saying, don't forget about me. I'm
Yeah.
here alone. And I think what has happened is some people have taken it upon themselves to also do that to others because
Yeah.
there is a bit of dopamine that gets spread. And I suggest using whatever technology you are most comfortable doing or asking the recipient how they want to receive, right?
Yeah.
Because some people like text, some people like WhatsApp,
Yeah.
some people actually like a phone call. So I think it's being very intentional.
um it's so interesting to kind of hear you talk about this and for you to have put this into a methodology and into a book, just the Susan that we all know, and watch this kind of go out to all the people we know and people talking about this and getting excited, especially as we emerge from this time. It certainly seems, and whenever I interview an entrepreneur, so I'm going to give you the entrepreneur treatment,
Uh-oh.
because you very much are one. I like to do a lot of research on them and try to figure out like what is their thing. But you made the thing pretty easy because you wrote a whole book on it. It's connections and really finding connections with other people. Why do you think? And I get the sense that that's deeply, deeply personal to you. This is not
Yeah.
something that you decided because you were bored to write a book on. You've been obsessed with this.
Yeah.
You practice what you preach. This is how we found each other, right?
Yeah.
Through these
Yeah.
types of connections. I get the sense that is deeply personal to you.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I grew up in a tiny little house in upstate New York, and I had two parents who were extraordinary connectors.
Hmm.
My father taught at a women's college for 39 years, and he not only would have students, but he would have the daughters of students and then the granddaughters of students. And until he died in 2008, he kept in touch with all of them. I mean, I
Right.
shouldn't say all. And at his memorial service, the letters that came in from
Yeah.
granddaughters. So and then my mother was literally called the woman who did social media before social media existed,
Uh-huh.
using a rotary phone and her manual typewriter. She did public
Mhm.
relations for PBS. And, she literally, I mean, would keep in touch with people everywhere. And what they would do every morning at the breakfast table, they would have the 5 local, I grew up in upstate New York. They would
Mhm.
spread the 5 local newspapers and yesterday's New York Times, and I would find one little spot for my bowl of cereal while they were clipping and cutting articles that reminded them of people. Then they would go
Oh,
to their
wow.
respective manual typewriters, type little teeny notes just saying, thinking of you, plop them
Mhm.
in the envelopes, and keep the postal service in business. So I assumed everybody did this. And they
Right.
also deeply ingrained in me this notion that everyone has a story. Every single person is worthy of our curiosity, of
Mhm.
our, no one should be kind of put aside because they don't have something to offer. And that has led me to be just this ridiculously curious person. But I'm so glad because every single person that I have had the luxury and gift of meeting, I have learned not only about them, but I've learned about myself. And it's also taught me to get rid of my assumptions, right?
Yeah.
We can't help it. I mean, it's human nature to have an assumption that, oh, it's not worth spending time with that person because it's not going to help me get to what I need to get to. But we don't know until we spend time with them. And
Yeah.
I want to share one quick story that I
Yeah.
think will really solidify because it did in my mind that I am never going to question like something again. I mean, obviously, I say that, but I have to. I mean, we all have to be mindful, right? We don't have unlimited time. But back in 2017, I received an email. It was about, I'm right where I am right now. And it was a busy day at McPherson Strategies. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon. And the email said, "Hi, Susan. A friend of mine is a filmmaker and he wants to get into a refugee camp tomorrow afternoon in Greece. Can you help? Now, it wasn't so out of left field because one of the boards I serve on is the US arm of the UN High Commission for Refugees. But a couple of things. One, it's not easy getting into a refugee camp. And two, all I kept thinking is the last thing the world needs is another documentary film about refugees that no one's going to see. But I had about 7 minutes before the next meeting, and I thought, you know what, just do it, make a few phone calls. Well, I was able to get the filmmaker into the camp. A week later, I learned that this filmmaker, Brant Anderson, was not a documentary filmmaker. He was a big budget Hollywood producer who had done a number of Tom Cruise films and who became passionate about the refugee cause.
Yeah.
A few months later, our friend Alana Berkowitz reached out to me. She was an advisor for the NGO CARE and said, Susan, do you happen to know a filmmaker or two who can go and spend 10 days on the Syrian border at the Azraq refugee camp to teach Syrian youth how to make film to tell their story of fleeing Syria? Hello. Right. So I reached out to Brant. Not only did he say yes, within 10 minutes, he brought along 8 other Hollywood filmmakers who then spent 2 weeks with these, I would call them almost children. And the films that they produced were beautiful. But there's more. He went on to raise millions of dollars and donate to CARE, to UNHCR, to UNICEF. And there's more. He created a narrative film that Angelina Jolie saw and was so enamored with the film, she has been taking it to world leaders because she is a major refugee advocate all over the world to help keep this story alive, that there are 88 million displaced people on this planet. Even though we're mired in COVID and climate change, that is an issue we need to keep alive. So I guess the long and short of it is, had I listened to my assumptions, I'm not suggesting that none of that would have happened had I not made that phone call, but I like to believe that I played a small role in helping make that happen.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We have to end it soon, so I'm going to ask you one last question. In the book, you have these prompts on how to go beyond small talk and develop closer relationships with people. You spoke a little bit about this earlier. You have different types of prompts in the book. We haven't had small talk during this, so don't read into that. But I thought it would be fun to try one.
Okay.
You got this this is from the New York Times, but you put some of these, you recycled some of these for the book, and they had like a list of questions to develop more meaningful connections. I went with number 7 because I liked it. It was, if you and I were to have a more meaningful relationship with each other, what would be important for me to know? So I want to end this by asking you that question. If you and I were to have a more meaningful relationship, what would be important for me to know?
Wow. This is awkward because now I need to answer the question. I think, this is going to sound so sappy, but I'm so grateful. And I'm going to start to cry because I'm like grateful for Reboot, and I'm grateful for my friends. And this has been a hard year. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, it is such a privilege to be able to sit and interview you. And you know what makes it even sweeter is knowing that you are not far, and that I can see you in person, and that this is just as you kind of, I think you said this in the book, it's just a means to be able to see each other and make it that much sweeter when we do.
Yes. And I can't wait for you to meet Phoebe, my better half.
I can't wait too. So I think that's a beautiful way to end it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you to Reboot. It's a beautiful.